The first knock was so faint, I thought it might be the wind tapping the shutters. But it came again low, steady, like someone deciding if they had the right to be heard. I crossed the yard, boots crunching in the snow, and opened the door. A young woman stood there, dress hem torn and heavy with mud, a shawl clinging to her shoulders. One hand gripped the frame, the other pressed to the swell of her belly. Her lips were pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and her voice rasped as she said, "I'll give birth to your child. Just let me in." For a long moment the cold between us felt sharper than the air, and I hadn't yet decided what to do next. Before I tell you what happened after I opened that door, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Caleb Rohr. I've spent most of my 41 years in Wyoming territory, though the land's not as wild as it once was. My father taught me the forge when I was a boy, heating wagon rims and shaping horseshoes for the ranchers who came through our valley. He believed a man's worth was in the work of his own hands and the way he treated his neighbors. Keep your word, share what you have, don't ask for more than you need. Sundays we'd ride into town for church, mother in her best bonnet, and afterward we'd take coffee on the steps with whoever stayed behind to talk. Life changed after the mines closed and the cattle herds drifted west. The younger men left for the railroads or the cities. Those of us who stayed made do with less patching boots instead of buying new trading eggs for lamp oil, holding on to what land we could. My own homestead sat a mile outside Gravel's End, where the wind cut harder and the road thinned to wagon ruts. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that can be both a comfort and a curse. I buried my wife Hannah in that soil 5 years ago, along with the child she couldn't bring into this world. Since then, I'd kept to myself, no company but the forge fire and the hens, no sound at night but the wind in the boards. I never cared much for town talk, but I knew the way folks' eyes lingered on me longer than they used to, like grief had left a mark that wouldn't fade. The general store opened when it pleased the owner. The saloon stayed noisy even when the streets froze over. I'd watch the wagons of speculators pass through men with city boots and clean hands sniffing at land they'd never worked a day in their lives. That wasn't my world. Mine was measured in cords of wood split in iron, shaped true and knowing exactly where each fence post stood when the storms came. I thought that winter would be like all the others, the forge burning late, the snow piling along the fence rails, no one crossing my porch unless they'd lost their way. But the knock that night was different. It wasn't loud enough to demand, just sure enough to be heard. When I opened the door, the sight of her in the lantern light told me two things: she hadn't come here by accident, and whatever road she'd walked was harder than most could survive. I stepped aside, the wind pushing past us into the room. And as she crossed the threshold, I knew the quiet in my house was about to change. Ruth's boots left small, uneven prints in the packed snow as she stepped into the house. She moved straight to the stove, leaning in toward the heat with her hands spread wide. The fingers were red at the tips, knuckles roughened, nails chipped. I asked if she was hungry, and she nodded without speaking. I cut a thick slice from a loaf, set it on a plate, poured a cup of water from the kettle. She sat on the cot and ate in quiet, each bite slow, like her body was still deciding whether it could believe the food would keep coming. When she was finished, she looked up and said her name was Ruth Baylor. I told her mine, and for a moment that seemed enough. She shifted on the cot, wincing as her hand went to her belly. When I asked if she was out here alone, she said yes. Then after a pause, she added that the child's father wasn't looking for a family. I didn't press for more. Her jaw was set, the hollowness in her cheeks, telling me she'd had more taken from her than she was ready to put into words. I told her she could sleep if she wanted. The fire would stay lit. She lay back on the cot without unlacing her boots, pulling her shawl over her eyes. I sat at the table listening to the wind scrape at the windows. Every so often, the house settled with a low creak. Near midnight, I woke to a sound from her, a small unguarded whimper, the kind a person makes when they think no one's near. I laid a blanket over her and stoked the fire before sitting down again. Morning light was thin and gray, spilling through the frost on the window. Ruth was still asleep, curled on her side, her shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked younger that way, though the wear in her face was something sleep couldn't mend. When she stirred, her first movement was to rest a hand against her belly, as if to make sure the child was still safe. I asked if she was hungry, and this time she hesitated before nodding. I fixed her bread, a boiled egg, and a bit of salted pork. She ate with more steadiness than the night before. "You can stay for a while," I told her. "Long as you need. I've got space." She stopped chewing for a moment and said she didn't want charity. I told her it wasn't charity, just a place to rest, and that company's worth something out here. She didn't answer, but when she finished eating, she offered to help around the place. "I'm not useless," she said. I told her I hadn't thought she was. The edge in her shoulders eased just enough for her to ask where the wash tubs were. From the window, I watched her walk to the lean-to behind the house. She moved with the unsteady gait of a woman well along in pregnancy, the boots on her feet still too big. Her dress was thin against the cold. I went to my workbench, pulling out scraps of leather. Boots could be mended, made to fit. That was something I could fix. By the time she came back in, her sleeves were damp, her hands raw from the wash water. She brushed off my suggestion to rest, insisting she was fine, though her breathing told another story. The afternoon passed in a stretch of quiet. She sat for a while, rubbing her wrists, then asked if I'd lived here alone long. I told her 5 years since my wife died in childbirth. She didn't offer condolences, just gave a small nod that felt like understanding. "That why you didn't ask questions when I showed up?" she asked. I said if she wanted to tell her story, she would. She looked down at her belly before speaking again. The man she'd been with, Clay, had kept her locked up, made promises, said she owed him. When she became pregnant, he called it leverage and started talking about selling her after the baby came. She'd left while he was sleeping, taking only what she could carry. I told her she'd made it. She said she didn't want to run anymore. I told her she didn't have to. That night, she removed her boots before lying down. I let her know there was porridge in the tin if she wanted it in the morning. She said she did. The days settled into a rhythm after that. I worked the forge, the steady ring of the hammer marking the hours while Ruth moved about the house and yard. She was careful in her work, slower some mornings when her back troubled her. She never complained. In the barn, she found the unfinished cradle I'd once built. "Was for the child?" she asked. I told her yes. She asked if I planned to finish it, and I said I'd started again last week. "Why?" she asked. I told her there was going to be a child in the house, and it ought to have a place to sleep. She didn't reply, just lowered herself onto an empty crate and sat while I worked. After a while, she said I didn't know her. I told her I knew enough that she worked, didn't lie, had been hurt, and was still here. That night, she stayed up folding shirts she'd found in an old trunk while I brought in more wood. We spoke little. Later, she asked if I ever thought about leaving. I told her every day, but then the forge gets warm, the chickens make noise, and I stay. She said she'd never had a place she wanted to stay in until now. When I asked if she had a name picked out, she said Isaac, a name Clay hated. I said it was a good name. She asked if I thought Clay would come for her. I told her if he did, he wouldn't like what he found. She looked at me then, and the answer she needed was already in my silence. That night, she didn't go to the cot. She stepped into the bedroom doorway and said she'd take the side near the wall. The bed was unfamiliar to her, but she lay down without tension. The quiet between us was different now. She asked if I thought this place might be home again. I told her more and more lately. Neither of us slept right away, but neither of us felt alone. By early March, the wind still had bite in it, though the snow along the fence posts had begun to soften. The road into Gravel's End was nothing more than a muddy stretch, and the mail cart passed through only once a week. Ruth moved slower these days, one hand often pressed to her lower back, the other steadying herself on a chair or door frame. She still kept to the small chores she could manage, boiling wash water, stirring stew, gathering eggs when the ground was dry enough, but the weight she carried made each task deliberate. I'd been in the forge that morning, the steady ring of the hammer carrying into the yard, when she stepped out to find me. Her boots left shallow prints in the softening ground, and she leaned against the barn doorway while I planed down the edge of a gateboard. "I saw the cradle," she said. I didn't look up from the plane. "Was for the child?" she asked. I told her yes. She asked if I planned to finish it. I said I had started again last week. She studied me a moment before asking why. I set the tool down and told her a child ought to have a place to sleep if it's in the house. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she crossed the floor slowly, lowered herself onto an upturned crate, and stayed there while I worked. After a while, she asked if I was afraid she might leave or bring trouble. I told her I'd already lost everything once, so there wasn't much left to fear. She looked at her hands, then back at me, and said I didn't even know her. I told her I knew enough that she worked. She told the truth. She'd been hurt, and she was still standing. That evening, she stayed up later than usual, folding old shirts from a trunk she'd found in the back room. I came in with snow on my shoulders and stamped my boots near the door. "Got more wood stacked," I said. She nodded and thanked me. I poured a small measure of rye, offered her some. And when she shook her head, I drank it slow, watching the fire. She asked where I'd grown up, and I told her Texas, that I'd joined a cattle outfit at 17 and fired a gun in earnest before I turned 19. She asked if I'd ever thought about leaving here. I told her I did every day, but then the forge got warm, the hens made noise, and I stayed. Her eyes stayed on the fire when she said she'd never had a place she wanted to stay in, not until now. I asked if she had a name in mind for the child, and she said Isaac. Clay had hated it, called it a preacher's name. I told her it was a good name. She asked again if I thought Clay would come for her. I said if he did, he wouldn't like what he found. She looked at me not for protection, but for proof that I meant it. The days edged longer. The snow pulled back from the edges of the yard, leaving patches of brown grass beneath the bare fence rails. Ruth began sorting a small pile of baby things beside the bed, a blanket she'd sewn, a carved rattle shirts I'd bartered for in town without telling her. One evening she stood in the barn doorway while I brushed down the horses. Her hand rested on the cradle frame. "I don't want to raise a child in fear," she said. I told her she wouldn't have to, and if Clay showed, I'd deal with it. She turned to me then. "I don't want blood spilled over me," she said. I told her we'd hope he was smart enough not to try anything. By the third week of March, she'd begun to feel the strain more often. She moved slower in the mornings, gripping the table edge, when a wave of tightness came. She didn't say much about it, but I noticed. One morning she was kneading bread when she stopped, leaned into the table, and held her breath. I walked over and put a hand on her shoulder, told her she needed to rest. She said she wanted to finish the loaf. I told her it would keep. She gave in, letting me guide her to the chair near the stove. That night the air was warmer than it had been in months, heavy with the promise of rain. The wind pushed wet against the windows, and by sundown the storm rolled in. Rain drummed hard on the roof, thunder echoing off the ridge. Ruth sat on the bed, arms folded under her belly, sweat at her hairline. The pains were real now, and she didn't hide them. I knelt beside her, a clean towel in hand. We had no midwife. She told me I'd stayed, and that was more than anyone ever had. When the next pain came, she gripped my arm, teeth clenched. Through the night, the storm didn't ease. Lightning flashed, the lamps burned low, and the stove's red glow held the room. Her labor became a steady rhythm, sharp waves followed by moments of hard, shallow breathing. She gripped the bed frame knuckles, white eyes fixed ahead. I stayed beside her, wiping her brow, keeping the water warm, adjusting the blankets. Hours passed without looking at the clock. At one point she said she couldn't do it anymore. I told her she already was. Her voice broke when she said she couldn't lose him. I told her she wouldn't not while I was there. By dawn the rain still fell softer now, but steady. The baby came with a cry that cut through the quiet. I wrapped him in a towel, checked his breathing, felt the warmth of him in my hands. Ruth fell back against the pillows, asking if he was all right. I told her he was. She held him against her chest, tears sliding along her temples. "We did it," she whispered. I sat beside her, my shirt damp, my hands still shaking from the night. For the first time in years, the house felt full. 2 days after the storm, the rain eased into a thin, steady drizzle. The yard was a patchwork of mud and shallow puddles, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Ruth moved slow, still sore, but steady enough to tend to the baby without help. Isaac slept often, waking only to feed or give a soft cry in the gray hours before dawn. I built a small box to hold cloths and bottles, and she showed me how to bathe him without chilling him. We didn't speak much about what came next. For the moment, getting through each day was its own work. On the third morning, I came in from the barn carrying a bucket of water and stopped in the doorway. Ruth was by the window, Isaac in her arms, light falling across her shoulder. Her hair was braided back, her skin pale, but no longer drawn tight with strain. She didn't see me at first. "You never asked," she said, still looking outside. I asked what she meant. What I want to do about staying, about the baby, about you. I set the bucket down and told her it hadn't seemed the right time. She turned then and said it was now. She told me she'd always wanted to be in a place that was quiet with food on the table, no locked doors, and no one keeping watch over her shoulder. I said she had that here. She admitted she didn't know if she'd still be welcome afterward. I told her she'd been welcome before. She stepped closer, saying I still hadn't asked for anything in return. I told her she'd given birth in this house, and that was enough. She sat at the table and laid Isaac in the cradle beside her. "I used to think survival was the best I could hope for," she said. "But now I want more. Not just for him, for me too." That afternoon I saddled the horse and rode into town for the first time in weeks. The road in was soft with mud, the sky a pale winter blue. At the general store, Burris, the keeper, gave me a look halfway between curious and cautious. He asked if I needed something. I told him flour, rice cloth for a shirt, and some dried fruit if he had it. As he packed the goods, he said some folks had been asking if a woman had passed through, 2 months back, walked with a limp, looked bruised. My hands stilled. I asked who. He said a man claiming to be her cousin, though he doubted it, with a whip scar across his face smelling of whiskey. Said his name was Clay. Burris didn't say the man was coming back, but he didn't think he was finished looking either. I paid and left, without another word, riding home slower than usual, watching the horizon. When I reached the house, Ruth was on the porch, rocking Isaac. She looked up, saw my face, and asked what it was. I told her someone in town had asked about her Clay by name. She held my gaze, then looked down at the baby. Her voice was steady when she said, "We'll be ready." I told her we would. That night I checked the locks and windows, cleaned the rifle, and made sure the horses were calm in their stalls. She didn't ask me to, but she watched. She folded another blanket into the cradle, tucking it around Isaac. "We need a name," she said. I reminded her she'd already chosen one. She smiled faintly. "Isaac suits him." Then she reached into her shawl and pulled out a folded, water-stained paper. She handed it to me, saying it was her proper name from before. I read it, Ruth Magdalena Baylor, born in Texas to a cattle hand and a school teacher. She said she wanted to be known by it again. I told her she was. We sat by the fire until the flames sank low. For the first time since she'd arrived, she rested her head on my shoulder. I didn't move, and I didn't speak. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a stillness that felt different than before. The next morning broke cold and bright, the frost thick along the fence rails. Just after sunrise, the dog barked from the yard, sharp and insistent. I stepped outside to split kindling and looked toward the east road. A rider was coming alone, the horse's breath clouding in the chill air. The rider came on slow, his coat catching the early light, the horse's hooves muffled in the soft ground. I stepped back into the house, shutting the door behind me. Ruth was in the chair by the fire, Isaac bundled in her arms. "You expecting anyone?" she asked. I told her no. She rose, holding the baby tighter, and carried him into the back bedroom without another word. I went to the chest by the stairs, lifted the rifle from inside, and checked the load. Through the window, I watched the man rein in near the fence line. He was lean, with a long scar running down his right cheek, his boots polished despite the road dust spurs glinting when he shifted. His eyes moved quick, measuring the yard and the house. "You roar," he called. I stepped onto the porch, rifle low but ready. I told him I was. He said a woman named Ruth Baylor had come through here, claimed she was his. Claimed she was carrying his child, which made her his by right. My answer was short. She wasn't his. He eased his coat back enough to show the butt of a pistol at his side. Said he'd come a long way and would be leaving with her. I told him he wouldn't. A silence stretched between us, the dog growling under the porch. He swung down from the saddle boots, crunching in the damp earth, and came a few steps closer. He said he knew what Ruth had told me, but that I didn't know the whole of it. Claimed she'd stolen from him, left in the night after he'd fed and sheltered her, and that he could have sold her, but hadn't, as though that was kindness. My grip on the rifle stayed steady. I told him that told me everything I needed to know. His mouth twisted into a sharp laugh. He said I thought hiding out here made me something that this land wouldn't forgive me for what had happened to my wife, that I'd frozen while she bled out. He said if I froze again, the woman and the baby would die in a place no one remembered. That was when I raised the rifle. He stopped mid-step. I told him he wouldn't get a second warning. His eyes darted toward the barn, the yard, the dog now growling louder. He must have seen the truth in my stance, because he stepped back, spit into the mud, and climbed back into the saddle. "She's broken," he said. "You'll see that soon enough." I told him to leave. He asked if I'd shoot him in the back. I said I'd shoot if he took one more step forward. He stared at me another moment, then turned his horse and rode off slow, like a man who'd realized something too late. I stood there until he was nothing more than a dark shape on the ridge. Then I went inside, set the rifle on the table. Ruth was standing in the doorway of the back room, Isaac still in her arms. She didn't look shaken, but her eyes were fixed on me. "Is he gone?" she asked. I told her yes. She asked if I was sure he wouldn't be back. I told her he'd seen what he needed to. She sat, keeping the baby close, said she'd thought she might have to run again. I told her she wouldn't not while I was here. She asked why I hadn't fired the second he came close. I told her this place had seen enough death, and you don't fight cowards with rage. You fight them by standing still. She rocked Isaac in the cradle for a while, the room quiet except for the soft crack of the fire. Then she said he'd known about my past, about what happened with Hannah, and that it hadn't rattled me. I told her it used to, but not anymore. That night she stepped outside and found me on the porch, the sky clear for the first time in weeks. She sat beside me, said I hadn't run from my past today. I told her she hadn't run from hers either. We sat in the quiet, Isaac asleep inside the stars, sharp against the dark. She asked if this was what healing looked like. I told her maybe it was just what staying looked like. By late spring, the frost had lifted from the yard, and thin shoots of grass pushed up along the fence line I'd repaired the summer before. Isaac had learned to sleep longer through the night, his cries coming softer and less often. Ruth moved with more ease now, though there was still caution in the way she bent or carried the pail from the pump. There was color back in her cheeks, and some mornings I'd hear her humming while she worked, not to quiet the room, but because she wanted to. Inside the cradle sat by the window, finished smooth and lined with a quilt stitched from old shirts and feed sacks. The seams were uneven, my hand clumsy with a needle, but she said it looked right that way. One morning, I brought her a cup of coffee where she stood near the stove. "He's quiet today," I said. She gave a tired smile and told me she'd already checked on him 3 times. "He's fine, just content," she added. We sat at the table in an easy silence, the kind that had settled between us over the past weeks. She glanced at me and asked if I still thought about leaving. I shook my head. She asked if I wondered what people in town thought. I told her probably less than we imagined. "You think they know what he tried to do to me?" she asked. I said some did, some chose not to. She let that rest. The talk drifted off, and we finished the coffee without another word. That afternoon, we took the wagon into Gravel's End together. Ruth sat beside me on the bench, Isaac wrapped snug in a sling against her chest. The town hadn't changed, the same weathered storefronts, the general store with its faded sign, the blacksmith shed I hadn't worked in since Hannah. A few folks nodded as we passed, some curious, some polite, but none asking questions. Inside the store, she picked out fabric coffee soap and a new tin pan. I carried the sack to the counter. Burris looked at Isaac and asked if the boy had a name yet. "Isaac Baylor," she said without pause. He asked if that was his full name. She looked at me, then answered, "It will be." Burris gave a short nod and wrapped the goods without comment. Back home, I put the horses away and oiled the gate hinges that had started to groan in the wind. Ruth cleaned the kitchen, rocked Isaac in the cradle when he fussed, and then stepped onto the porch as the light was fading. I joined her carrying a folded sheet of paper. I handed it to her, and she opened it slowly. It was the deed, my land, my home, her name written beside mine. "You don't have to sign it now," I said, "or at all. But it's yours if you want it, not just to stay, to own, to decide." She looked out over the yard, the barn, the stretch of road that ran to nowhere, then folded the paper and placed it in her lap. "I never thought I'd get to choose," she said. "You do now," I told her. After a long pause, she asked, "What are we, Caleb?" I met her eyes and told her we were a family. "You sure?" she asked. I told her I was. I reached over, rested my hand on hers, and she turned her palm to meet it. She leaned her head against my shoulder, her eyes closed. Isaac's breathing soft through the open window behind us. There were no shadows at the fence line that night. No debts left hanging. Ruth had stayed. I had stayed. The boy had been born into stillness, not fear. We both knew there would be hard years ahead. Drought sickness days when the land wouldn't give what we needed. But we would meet them together. That night, Ruth stood in the bedroom doorway, holding Isaac the lantern, casting gold light across her face. "You coming?" she asked. I rose from the table and followed her, enclosing the door behind us. By midsummer, the land had turned a deep, steady green, and the days stretched long enough to finish every chore before the light faded. Isaac had grown heavier in my arms, his grip strong when he wrapped his fingers around mine. Ruth moved with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer had to measure every step. She took him out to the garden most mornings, letting him feel the air and the sun on his skin while she weeded the rows. The house carried a different sound now. The scrape of a chair across the floor meant supper was being readied. The creak of the porch boards was her stepping out to shake crumbs from a cloth. In the evenings, we'd sit with the windows open, letting in the warm breeze that smelled faintly of hay and river water. There was no talk of leaving. No talk of what might come down the road. One afternoon, I rode into Gravel's End alone to pick up salt and lamp oil. At the store, Burris leaned over the counter and told me he'd heard Clay was seen 2 towns east buying supplies. He didn't linger on it, but the meaning was clear. On the ride back, I kept to the higher trail where I could see further in all directions. When I reached the house, Ruth was on the porch with Isaac, rocking slow. I told her what Burris had said. She didn't stiffen, didn't pale, but her eyes held mine a long moment before she looked back at the yard. "If he comes again, we'll handle it," she said. I told her we would. In the days that followed, I made small changes. The rifle stayed near the door. I checked the latch on the barn at night and kept the lantern trimmed and ready. Ruth went about her work, but I could tell she noticed. Some evenings, she sat beside me in the porch chairs, Isaac asleep inside, and the quiet between us carried more weight than before. A week later, we took the wagon into town together. Ruth needed fabric, and I wanted to speak to the wheelwright about a repair before winter. The air was heavy, the sky pale with heat. As we passed the blacksmith's shed, a few men standing outside fell silent, their eyes following us until we turned the corner. At the store, Ruth greeted Burris plainly, chose what she needed, and paid without waiting for me to step forward. On the way back to the wagon, she said nothing, but I saw the way her chin lifted a little higher. That night, we ate on the porch. The horizon burned orange where the sun had dipped, and the first stars pricked through the darkening sky. Ruth laid a sleeping Isaac in the cradle and sat back down. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said quietly. I told her that was good. "But I'm not foolish either," she added. "If he comes, I'll be ready." I nodded, knowing she meant it. The next morning was still and warm, the air thick enough to slow your breath. I was mending a hinge on the barn door when I heard the dog give a low bark from the porch. Ruth stepped outside, shading her eyes. "Someone's coming," she said. I wiped my hands and joined her. Down the road, a single rider approached the sun, catching on the metal of his stirrup. He was too far off to make out clearly, but the steady pace told me this wasn't a neighbor passing through. We stood there until the figure grew larger, the sound of hoofbeats carrying on the hot air. I told Ruth to stay with Isaac and walk to the edge of the yard. The rider was close enough now for me to see he carried no rifle in the saddle scabbard, just a small satchel tied behind him. He slowed as he neared the fence, raising a hand in greeting. "Got a letter for you," he called, his voice carrying easy in the stillness. The rider handed down the envelope, the paper thick and creased from travel. My name was written in a hand I didn't know. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode back the way he'd come, without another word. Inside, Ruth stood by the table with Isaac on her hip, watching as I broke the seal. The letter was from the circuit judge, stating plainly that Clay had been arrested in a neighboring county. A warrant had been waiting for him since the day he'd fled. He would stand trial before the month was out. Ruth read it after me, her eyes steady. She let out a slow breath, not in relief exactly, but in something close to it. "Then it's finished," she said, and I nodded. The trial was swift. Witnesses spoke and the truth stood clear under the open eye of the court. Clay was sentenced, his threats put to rest for good. Ruth didn't go to see it. She stayed here, tending to Isaac, keeping the home she'd built inch by inch since the day she arrived. When I came back from town with the news, the sun was setting over the pasture, laying gold across the grass. She was on the porch, rocking Isaac, the boards creaking under the slow rhythm. I told her it was over, that he wouldn't trouble her again. She just looked out over the land, her free hand resting on the arm of the chair. Life settled into its own quiet measure after that. The seasons turned, the fields changed color, and Isaac learned to walk across the same porch boards his mother had once stepped on with such caution. Ruth laughed more easily now, spoke freely to neighbors in town, and her eyes no longer carried that far-off watchfulness. Some nights we'd sit outside in the dark, the lantern burning low between us, and the only sound would be the night insects and the soft wind moving through the grass. Out here in this hard and open country, justice didn't always come quick. But when it came, it was worth the waiting. If there's a thing I've learned from all of it, it's that a person can start over if given the chance. And that sometimes the strongest families are the ones you find along the trail, not just the ones you're born to. I reckon that's worth holding on to. And maybe if you've walked a hard road yourself, you'll know why this matters. If you've been listening this far, I thank you. Share it with someone who might take heart from it, and maybe think a while on what it means to stand by another even when the dust's still settling.